Well, thank you. As you can see, Donald Trump has worn me down. But you know, I'm beginning to grow. I really am. The first 2 years, I was kind of containing the catastrophe, wasn't it? And now, I mean, look, Nancy Pelosi, can we just express... I mean, I don't know about you. I am very proud that I am here in the Bay Area, and you should be proud that you are in San Francisco, because, you know, she has a spine of steel. I mean, that shutdown, he has met his match. But it's not just Nancy Pelosi. You know, AOC, as she is known. And we've got women in Congress who are extraordinary, some who have already been there, a new crop of women who, the diversity of the members of Congress is something that I don't know about. I'm very proud of the people who have been elected. And a lot of it is your doing and our doing. The other thing that I've noticed, and you probably have as well, is that it's not just anti-Trump what we're hearing from a lot of, and I don't mean to make this too partisan a speech or a discussion. I mean, I respect many of you. Some of you may be Republicans, and I respect you. I don't like you, but I respect you. No, that's not true. I like you and I respect you. I'm going to get back to this. But what we're seeing and what we're hearing now are things that I would not have guessed would be heard so quickly, such as raising taxes on the very rich, the super rich, a wealth tax. People are talking, everybody now, it seems like, is talking about Medicare for all and a single-payer plan. These are things that were on the left, but I just read a bunch of polls this morning, and they showed that if you're looking at raising taxes on the very wealthy, it turns out that 48% of registered Republicans want to raise taxes on the very wealthy. I mean, we're not talking about things that are just on the left. Medicare for all is now supported by 70% of the public. Thinks that we should expand Medicare dramatically to cover people. And it makes obvious sense in the following way. We have the most expensive healthcare system in the world. We are relying on private health insurers who are private for-profit health insurers who, because they are private and for-profit, they are looking for healthy people and they want to avoid sick people. So we have the only healthcare system in the world designed to avoid sick people. It doesn't make a lot of sense when you think of it that way. And it is extraordinarily expensive, and it is not doing a job. In fact, we still have huge numbers of people who are not covered at all, who have no health insurance, never see a doctor. And those who are covered, the co-payments, deductibles, we all know this. But the interesting thing is the rest of the country is now beginning to understand it as well. They're not falling for the propaganda. Over taxes, over health care, over almost anything, the pendulum seems to be swinging. And what I want to talk about tonight with you is why that seems to be happening, why also we ended up a couple of years ago with Donald Trump. What happened to the common good? Is the common good actually coming back? You know, say what you want about Donald Trump. He at least has brought us back to first principles, basics, democracy versus dictatorship, common good versus the good of just a few, questions of morality, not just politics, public morality. You know, I teach economics and politics, and for years, I've been struggling over what seemed to me to be an obvious reality that the disciplines of politics and economics don't really fully acknowledge, and that is that you can't really talk about economics without talking about politics. They're intimately connected. You can't talk about politics without talking about economics. They are intimately connected. And sociology is part of politics and economics. In the 19th century, the entire field was known as political economy. There was no separate subject called economics until 1890, when the great British economist Alfred Marshall wrote his wonderful, majestic Principles of Economics, and that's when the economics field moved over and separated itself from politics. It was all political economy. People understood that it was a study of the system as a system. And in the 18th century, it was not even political economy. Adam Smith called himself a moral philosopher. Not an economist, not a political economist, a moral philosopher. Why is that? Because the study of economics and politics was, at least in the 18th century, the Enlightenment 18th century, a study of what is a good society. Morality was at the center of that discussion, and it was public morality. And so, what happened? What happened in the 20th century? Well, for most of the 20th century, or much of the 20th century, it still was, even though economics and politics and sociology and history were all separate, and even though the study of public philosophy and education were at different places, there were still a lot of connections between them and the rhetoric of the common good. We used it, the greater good. It wasn't just a political rhetoric. It was something that in conversations people talked about. You read of the 20s and the 30s, a lot of essay writers, a lot of books were written about the subject of what is the common good. What is it that we want to do together? What is the purpose of society? And then came the Depression, and then came World War II, and it solidified, I think, in people's understandings that they were in the same boat together. Almost everybody suffered in the Depression. Almost everybody was affected by World War II. And then when we came out of the war, I was born in 1946. Bill Clinton was born in 1946. George W. Bush was born in 1946. Donald Trump was born in 1946. Anybody who's anybody was born in 1946. Dolly Parton was born. Cher was born in 1946. So why were we all born in 1946? Demographers. I remember when I first talked to a set of demographers about population studies, they were scratching their heads. Look at that, the baby boom, just the baby boom. It all started in 1946. And they were, well, I didn't think it was a very puzzling thing. My father served in World War II, and he came home. And there was my mother. And that was happening all over the country. And so you had 76 million people starting in 1946, ending in 1964. Most of you, some of you, I'm just sort of eyeballing it. I would say about maybe 60% of you are between 1946 and 1964. And then you have a kind of a trough. I don't mean to be in any way derogatory if you're in that trough, but then and then we have the Millennials, who are very much the children of the boomers, and they are a very, very large generation. But being a boomer, what I remember, and some of you who are my age or near my age might remember the same thing, the 1950s and 60s, and even maybe the beginning of the 70s, were a time that is very different from the current time in the sense that there was an understanding of progress. We knew that we were far away from what society should be. And that's why many of us fought for civil rights and voting rights and marched against the Vietnam War. And it is also why many of us got involved in the women's rights movement, because women were second-class citizens to a very large extent, and there was a lot of homophobia. It was not a wonderful period of time, but at least we understood that we had work to do. At least we understood that there were a set of ideals that propelled that work. There was an unfinished agenda. I was 14 years old when John F. Kennedy said, ask not what you can do or what America can do for you, ask what you can do for America. And then 7 years later, I took a job in Bobby Kennedy's Senate office. And it was my first experience in Washington. I was an intern in Bobby Kennedy's Senate office, and I was overwhelmed with just a sense of excitement and momentum. Again, there were huge problems. My job, by the way, was not terribly glamorous. I was assigned to run his signature machine. Do you remember? I don't know how many of you remember what signature machines were. There was a pen at the end of a large wooden, usually a kind of a wooden arm that had a battery, and it was connected to a little motor, and you lined up the particular stationery with the senator's name at the top, and you made sure that whatever was on the body of the letter was lined up perfectly, and then I turned on the signature machine and it wrote Robert F. Kennedy at the bottom, and I would do this maybe 7 hours a day. I got very tired. I got so bored that by nighttime I would occasionally sneak into his office and I would write letters on his stationery to my friends. Dear Mr. Dworkin, congratulations on having the largest nose in New York State. Robert F. Kennedy. And my friends still have these letters on their walls. But at least I had a sense, I was very bored, but I had a sense I was doing something. I was in some very small way responding to the admonition, to the inspiration of his late brother, saying, do what you can do for the country. I was doing a little something for the country. I was running the signature machine. And one day, I was standing in the corridor of that Senate office building, and out from the elevator came Robert F. Kennedy, surrounded by his aides. I had not seen him. I had signed his letters, but I had not seen him. He was very busy, and he saw me in the corridor, and he looked at me, and he said, "How's the summer going, Bob?" Bob. He knew my name. And I blathered. I don't even know that I could say anything. But the fact that he knew my name, the fact that he respected the interns in his office enough to even learn their names was amazing to me. If he had asked me to run his signature machine, or anybody in the office had asked me to run his signature machine for the next 2 years, I would have done it. But there was idealism in the air. Well, what happened to that idealism? Where did that go? I want to suggest to you that some of it, and I want to suggest to you, because I'm not an economic determinist, but I do think that politics, economics, sociology, and moral philosophy all do go together to the extent that something happened in the late 70s, early 1980s, that we've not spent enough time thinking about or talking about, that is still with us, the legacy. And maybe the best way of describing it is that from 1946 to 1978, 81, that 3-decade span, the economy rose, productivity rose pretty steadily, but the median wage rose almost exactly in tandem with that rise in productivity and economic growth. And then in 1978, 79, there's kind of not exactly clarity about exactly what year it happened, but it happened in that interval. The median wage flattened. The economy kept growing, productivity kept going up, but the median wage went nowhere for the next 40 years. Now, this is a profound change. It's a profound change in the sense that when I was young, everybody assumed that they would be living better, that they would be moving upward, that their children would be living better than they. Inside this notion of idealism and progress was embedded the idea that we were all in a rising boat, a rising tide, that everybody, in fact, even John F. Kennedy talked about the rising tide lifting all boats. That was his metaphor. And then something happened that changed all of that. What is it that happened? Well, some of it has to do with technology. New technologies came on stream that had been developed in World War II, but it took them a while to actually seep into the economy. And I'm talking about satellite communication technologies and cargo ships and container ships and a lot of new technologies that enabled the production process to be fragmented and parceled out around the globe to wherever things could be done most cheaply. Technology and globalization, one of those words that have gone from obscurity to meaninglessness without any intervening period of coherence. And I'll try to explain both technology and globalization, but what happened was there was an inflection point at the late 70s, beginning of the 80s, where technology and globalization changed the value of labor. And when I say the median wage flattened, I'm not talking about average wages. Averages and median, you know, are very, very different. The basketball player Shaquille O'Neal and I have an average height of 6'4". People at the top always bring up the average. That doesn't really tell you very much. That's why the median, half above, half below, is so important when you're discussing issues such as standard of living. It wasn't just technology and globalization. There was also a shift in politics, a shift in political power, exemplified, obviously, most obviously by Ronald Reagan's election, the firing of air traffic controllers. Do you remember that, 1981? It sort of signaled the beginning of a war on organized labor. In the 1950s and 1960s, 35% of the American workforce in the private sector was unionized. That gave American workers a big voice. Right now, in the private sector in the United States, fewer than 7% of workers are unionized. The shutdown that we just experienced ended partly because Nancy Pelosi was so tough, but also partly because the air traffic controllers called in sick, mostly in LaGuardia, but it started to spread around the country. Never underestimate the power of frustration at airports to motivate political actors to change what they're doing. 4 hours after that sick-in called by the air traffic controllers, the shutdown was ended. divine retribution. 38 years after the air traffic controllers were fired, they stopped the shutdown. So it was, again, just to rehearse, it was not only technology and globalization, it was also a shift in political power against labor, and also a shift in finance. There are a lot of things that happened in that era. For example, this is one thing that I came across almost by accident. Up until 1982, it was illegal for companies to buy back their shares of stock. It was considered to be manipulation of stock prices under the 1933-34 Securities Act. And a fellow named Jonathan Shadd, how many of you remember him? Nobody. He was head of the Securities and Exchange Commission under Ronald Reagan. He decided that he and the commission, which he controlled, would make it legal to buy back your shares of stock. Now, that may seem a very, very small issue, but it wasn't small, because once companies could buy back their shares of stock, they actually could, in some sense, manipulate things. And I'll get to this in a moment, but I want to just suggest to you that there's an entire mosaic of laws and regulations that began to shift. They began to shift in a way that advantaged those with a lot of economic power, not just political power, but also economic power. That's when you begin to get also the takeovers of companies. Up until 1979, it was unheard of for there to be unfriendly takeovers or for people who were corporate raiders. We didn't even know what a corporate raider was. There was nobody called a corporate raider. And then suddenly you had all of these peoples who used junk bond financing. Do you remember this? Some of you remember. Some of you have no idea what I'm talking about. But they used high-risk loans, and they summoned a lot of capital from people who wanted to and had the capital to gamble with, and they used those high-risk loans to actually buy companies, and they bought companies they thought were, quote-unquote, underperforming. Well, the companies were underperforming in the sense that the companies could make more money by firing their workers or outsourcing jobs or leaving their communities and going to an anti-labor state or going to Southeast Asia. Yes, there were all kinds of ways of performing better if you define performance only in terms of maximizing share prices, but that's not the way we used to define corporate performance. But we started to define it that way in the 1980s when the corporate raiders, who are now more politely described as private equity managers. I don't mean to. Is anybody here a private equity manager? I don't mean to insult anybody, because I think that these were efficiencies. There were efficiency gains, but there were social costs that followed all of this. And if you connect all of the dots that I've given you, you have a good idea why, quite surprisingly to America, in ways that we didn't really talk about at the time because we didn't know what was happening, wages started flattening. Now, when wages began flattening, American families used 3 strategies to maintain what they felt were their living standards. Despite the fact that male wages were dropping, what happened? Strategy number 1, women into paid work. Now, poor women were already in paid work, but middle-class and lower-middle-class women were not, in the post-war eras, they were homemakers, we called them. My mother stayed home. It's not as if we had a great deal of money. We certainly didn't. But my mother was the homemaker. She was a housewife. She was in charge of the children, my sister and I. But in 1978, 79, 1980, this huge wave of women went into paid work. Now, they still had to do the housework, they felt, and their husbands felt. They still had to make the dinner, they still had to take care of the kids, but they added paid work to everything else they were doing, And that was the first strategy to maintain family incomes. You had to have two incomes, not just one. A huge social and sociological change. Huge. We pretended it was all about, in fact, I was sitting in a class not too long ago where people were talking about, well, the fact that all these wonderful opportunities opened up to women in the late 70s because of the women's liberation movement or women's... Well, no, most women went to work. They were not professional women. They went into work in order to prop up family incomes. That was the big change. But that didn't last for a long time because even when you had two incomes, you still had to continue to bring in more money in order to maintain your living standards in an economy that was no longer working for most people the way it was before. And so strategy number two, by the mid-1990s, and I was labor secretary at that time, and I began to see, as I went around the country, more and more two couples, that is, more and more families with two wage earners. What did they do? They were working longer and longer hours. And the hours worked went off the charts. I remember thinking, how in the world were people managing to work this much? What many couples were doing was actually doing it in shifts. One of them was working part of the day and the other was working part of the day, and they never saw each other. In fact, I used to do focus groups around the country, and I'd hear from families, and they would say, well, we're just working, that's all we do is we work, we don't even see each other. We work. I used to have an acronym for these couples called DINS, D-I-N-S, double income, no sex, because there was no opportunity for anything. I think that may have been responsible for our population drop, maybe, in those years. Then there was even that second strategy of working all hours was exhausted by the late 1990s, early in this century. What was the third strategy for keeping up, for maintaining family living standards? It was to go into debt. Using rising home values, we all assume that home values will continue to rise forever, using rising home values as the vehicle for getting home loans or for refinancing homes. And that was a third strategy that millions, tens of millions of American families used to actually keep up their standard of living. And then came, of course, the debt bubble. The housing bubble burst. And that was the end of that third strategy. Now, the reason I'm going through this with you is because when the last coping mechanism was exhausted, and when we went into the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, a lot of Americans lost their savings. They lost their homes, some lost their jobs, many lost their jobs, and many people saw that Wall Street got bailed out. They saw that the bankers did okay, but if they were underwater with their homes, they didn't get bailed out. They might have lost their homes. If they lost their savings, they didn't get bailed out. If they lost their jobs, they didn't get bailed out. Something seemed rotten about the system. And I remember hearing in 2008, 2009, 2010, why is it that they got bailed out? Why did Wall Street get bailed out and everybody else is barely treading water? Do you remember the Occupy movement on the left and the very, very powerful on the right Tea Party movement? Occupy was very brief. The Tea Party movement sort of morphed into something else. But there was a time there in 2010, 2011, 2012, when you had both on the left and the right people who were angry for very similar reasons. They felt that the game was rigged. They looked at what had happened. They saw that there was no longer any coping mechanism. Certainly, the widening gap between the people at the top and everybody else was now revealed for all to see. And the anger was palpable. Anger. Because remember, as I told you a couple of minutes ago, the economy kept on growing, productivity kept on growing, but wages were flat. People had used in their families 3 coping mechanisms that were now exhausted. Where did all the money go? Where did all the money go if wages were flat? Class. It went to the top. Now, I say this with some hesitancy because whenever you talk about this, people get uncomfortable because it sounds like you're engaging in class warfare. You're a class warrior. I'm not a class warrior. I'm a class worrier. Because I was worried, and many of us were worried, and you were probably worried about the same thing. Because when you have more and more income and wealth concentrating at the top, when most people are going nowhere, when they start feeling like the game is rigged against them, when they start getting angry, that is the beginning, whether you're left or on the right. That's the beginning of something different in American politics. It happened before. It has happened before. It happened in the first Gilded Age of the 1880s, 1890s. Populism. William Jennings Bryan, you remember him, old Bill. In 2015, I was going around researching a book. I was in the Rust Belt, and I was in Kentucky and Tennessee and North Carolina. I went all over the South and Missouri and the Rust Belt, and I kept on, again, focus groups. I kept on asking groups of people, what do you think about what's happening in politics, and who are you supporting? This is 2015. This is just the beginning, early days of the 2016 election cycle. And what I kept on getting back from farmers in Missouri and from suburbanites in Kentucky and whatever small businesses and regular working people, union people in the Rust Belt, I kept on getting back, well, 2 people. We're very attracted to 2 people. The same person would say to me, we're very attracted to 2 people. And I'd say, who are those 2 people? Well, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. When I first heard that, I said, what? These 2 people, you might as well be, they're on different planets. How can you say them in the same sentence? But what people kept saying to me is that these people, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, they will shake things up. They are not part of the system. They're not part of business or politics as usual. They will be something fundamentally different, and they will change our political system in ways that I believe will benefit me instead of the elites, instead of them. Now, what Donald Trump then did, what demagogues do, is take anger and then channel that anger towards scapegoats. Scapegoats who, for Donald Trump and for many people in this country, became immigrants or Muslims or blacks, Latinos. You know the routine with regard to channeling economic insecurity and anger and frustration into anger at them. That has happened in many places around the globe historically. Bernie Sanders was a different kind of populist. Bernie Sanders was kind of a progressive populist that called for a revolution, a political revolution. But on the one hand, you had an authoritarian, xenophobic, racist type populist, and then you had a progressive populist, but much of their message, if you listen carefully to their message, it was about the rigging of the economy. And I remember calling, I knew Hillary Clinton from when she was, in fact, I had known Hillary Clinton from when she was an undergraduate at Wellesley. I even dated Hillary Clinton once. That was before she was Hillary Clinton. She was Hillary Rodham. It wasn't really that much of a date. I was president of my sophomore class, and she was president of her freshman class, and so we had what we called a presidential summit. That's all I'm going to say. Actually, in 2008, when she ran against Barack Obama, I got a call from the New York Times, a reporter from the New York Times. He said, we found a collection of her letters from college, from Wellesley, and she mentions that she went on a date with you. And is there anything that you can tell us about that date that might shed light on how she would perform as a president? And I said, well, I put my tongue firmly in my cheek, and I said, well, all I can remember about that date is we went to a movie and she wanted an inordinate amount of butter on her popcorn. And then I heard nothing on the other end of the telephone. I thought he had hung up on me. I said, are you still there? He said, yes, I'm just writing all this down. We went to Yale Law School together, Hillary Clinton and her husband, Bill Clinton, and in the same class, Clarence Thomas. And, it's the Socratic Method. So those of you who have been to law school or you know about law school, in those days, law school professors would very sternly call on the people who did not even have your hand up. But if you had your hand up, you were protected a little bit if you knew the answer. And I remember in those classes that Hillary Clinton was the first one with her hand up, and the professor would call on her, and she always had a perfect answer, almost sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph. It was just frightening to the rest of us. And I put up my hand, 2 or 3 times, or maybe second or third hand, and I got it right about half the time. And Clarence Thomas never said a word. And Bill Clinton never attended class. These patterns start very, very early. Anyway, I called Hillary Clinton's campaign, and I said to her, I didn't talk to her directly, I talked to the head of policy. I said, there's this rising tide of anger and populism, and you really have to talk about inequality and the concentration of wealth and power in this country. This is what people are understanding. The game is rigged. You've got to really talk about how you're going to unrig it. You've got to talk. And we didn't really get very far. And I think we didn't get all that far because I don't think, and I served in the Clinton administration, I don't think she or her husband, with due respect, I don't think they got the degree of anger and anti-establishment anger that was welling up and that's still welling up. Still there. Still there in both parties. Now, I say this because it's important to understand that even if Donald Trump were impeached tomorrow, and he won't be tomorrow, even if Donald Trump were not president, given the degree of populist anger and suspicion and distrust, there's a chance that we would find another demagogue or another Donald Trump. It is important for us, it seems to me, to look at the source of all of this. Donald Trump is a symptom. He's a consequence. He is not the source of the problem we're talking about. concentrated wealth and income at the top translates almost directly into power. And that power, which is political power, is power to change the rules of the game to make those who have a lot of economic power even wealthier. Do you see the vicious cycle? What I started to talk to you about when it came to healthcare, we're talking about other things, the rules of the game changing. Well, just this morning, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau decided that it was perfectly okay for payday lenders to charge the equivalent of 400% annualized interest on loans. Now, they didn't come to that conclusion, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, on their own. They didn't just say, oh, why don't we allow payday lenders to charge 400% interest today? No. They got that idea because of the power of the financial interests with regard to those engaged in payday lending. Much of what I have seen happen in Washington, certainly since I was Secretary of Labor, and especially over the last decade and a half, has to do with the abuse of power and money. When I went to Washington, and originally as an intern for Robert F. Kennedy, 3% of members of Congress, when they retired, became lobbyists. Today, both among Democrats and Republicans, 50% become lobbyists. Why did we go from 3% to 50%? Well, it's not that members of Congress who retire today have far fewer scruples than they did in 1968, 69. No, the difference is that there's so much more money in Washington. Lobbyists can make so much more. The influence industry is so much bigger. Louis Brandeis, the great justice of the Supreme Court, at the end of the era we now call the First Gilded Age, said, we have a choice. We can either have great wealth in the hands of a few, or we can have a democracy. But we can't have both. He had seen in the Gilded Age the effect of huge amounts of money in the hands of a few people called robber barons, that's what they were called in those days, who used their money to influence and corrupt legislatures, not only at Congress but states as well. The lackeys of the robber barons literally put sacks of money down on the desks of pliant legislators and got what they want. It was an era of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary poverty, an era of corruption, of big money, of anger and populism. And the good news is that America did not stand for it. We had an era after that, starting in 1901, which we now call the Progressive Era, in which we busted up, Teddy Roosevelt, Republican, busted up monopolies, got money out of politics, for at least for a time, began tackling the problems of the poor, instituted an income tax, pure food and drug laws, and also began the process of recognizing unions and organized labor. You see the pendulum, and there is a pendulum in American politics. We did not then, we will not now, succumb to the isms, to communism or fascism. Not here. That's not our tradition. We tend to be much more pragmatic. We tend, when we see the dimensions of the problem, to roll up our sleeves collectively and get on with whatever has to be done. I don't know how many of you have traveled across the country by car. Have you? It's a wonderful experience. I have done it about 6 times, and every time I do it, I marvel not only at the size of the country, but also at the people I meet. Americans are not ideological. We are very practical. When I came out to Berkeley, I left Cambridge, Massachusetts in my Mini Cooper 15 years ago. I remember I was in a gas line in Oklahoma City, waiting to get gas, and truckers came up to my Mini Cooper. They knocked on the window. I lowered the window. They said, "What is this?" I said, "This is a Mini Cooper." They said, "Well, we've never seen that." There were no Mini Coopers in the center of the country, the flyover of America. And then one of the truckers said, "How does anybody fit in there?" I couldn't help myself. I opened the door, stood up and said, "No problem." They looked frustrated and a little bit crestfallen, depressed, and I said, "I'm from Massachusetts. Everybody is under 5 feet tall in Massachusetts." And then I got to Berkeley, and it was 3,000 miles away from Cambridge, and I was amazed to discover that I was back in Cambridge. Sociologically, culturally, I really had not moved. I mean, the climate was better. First time I took my car up University Avenue, and I remember the aroma. This was back in the 60s, actually. It was a Volkswagen in those days, not a Mini Cooper. And I remember the smell. I remember the extraordinary, intoxicating, almost the blend of eucalyptus and marijuana and tear gas. It was just... I said, "This is where I belong." Well, we are, I think, a very decent people. And if you look at people across the country, the first responders and the teachers and the social workers and people who are doing the regular jobs, people are very kind. The issue of public morality or abuse of power, that's the problem. It's at the upper reaches. It's the people who are supposed to run our institutions. That's where we've got into trouble. That's where the vicious cycle is located. I saw it start under the Clinton administration. I saw it start when Bill Clinton, who is still a dear friend, began renting the Lincoln bedroom to big money. The only hotel where the guest leaves a mint on the pillow, or more. Jeff Bezos, richest man in America, claimed today that he was being blackmailed by the National Enquirer, a fellow named Pecker. Can you imagine a Dickensian character more appropriately named than Mr. Pecker? And Mr. Pecker actually is a friend of Donald Trump. You see how all of this, in some sleazy way, begins to fit together. What really I find most dismaying about the current administration, I can understand, and I could even possibly forgive, it's hard, It's hard, leaving the Paris Accord, turning one's back on climate change, basically making it harder for people to organize unions, attacking the Affordable Care Act, and the list goes on and on. But what I can't abide is the denigration of our institutions of government. The lack of respect. I've worked for 4 presidents, one of them a Republican, Gerald Ford. I tell my students at Berkeley that I once worked for the Ford administration, Gerald Ford, and they look blankly at me. I say there was a president named Ford. I said before that I was a special assistant to Abraham Lincoln. I've worked for 4 presidents, and I don't know, I hope you have had a chance. If you haven't, I hope someday you do, to actually go into the White House, into the West Wing, into even the Oval Office, and you're struck by the history and majesty and the institutional responsibility that adheres to that place and that office. The great pendulum of American history is beginning to move. What I had to say to you tonight was really not about Democrats versus Republicans. It was more about a great wave of anti-establishment anger that is there because the system really is, sadly, unfortunately, rigged. It's rigged not because anybody is bad. It's rigged because too much big money is corrupting the system, and there is too much big money concentrated at the top of our system. Louis Brandeis was absolutely correct. And finally, what do we do about all this? Well, we can celebrate the fact we have Nancy Pelosi and a new Congress, and we've got some very, very good people in state government, and here in California we have a Democratic legislature and a Democratic governor, and we can be very pleased about all this, but let me just make sure you know, and you probably do know, that you must stay organized and active. Nothing good happens in Washington or even in Sacramento unless good people are mobilized and organized and inspired to make it happen. The bullies, the big money, the abuses of power will happen regardless of who is there unless we are organized to prevent it. When I was a kid, I was bullied a lot, partly because I was very short. At one point in my life, I found that there were older boys who would protect me from the bullies. One of those older boys was named Mickey Schwerner. In 1964, Michael Schwerner was registering voters in Mississippi, along with Cheney and Goodman, 2 other civil rights workers, and they were tortured and murdered. And when I heard that my protector from the bullies had been killed by the real bullies, it changed my life. And I committed myself to fighting the bullies wherever they are. The people who have power and who have treat other people as if they are the enemies or are dirt, they can be pushed around. The only way to stop them is for all of us to mobilize and to organize. And we must continue to do that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you. And we now have Stephanie, I think, has a microphone. And we have two microphones. And so you may have some questions, and we'll take a few minutes for your questions. And why don't we start, Stephanie, should we start on this side, on my left?
Yes.
Anybody who has a question, please don't hesitate.
All right, one, I watch you on CNN all the time and you're the best. And secondly, I have two quick questions. One, who do you think is going to win the Democratic nomination? And two, who would you like to win the Democratic nomination?
Well, the answer to number one is I don't know. The answer to number two is I don't know. No, I don't want to be flip about it. I think that there are, or it looks like there are going to be a number of very, very attractive candidates. And I waver back and forth between looking for somebody who I think is going to be an absolutely great president and somebody who's going to beat Donald Trump. And they're not necessarily the same person. And that's going to be a little bit of a conundrum for us. Another question.
Right here on your right.
Do you see a path for the Democrats to take back the Senate?
It's going to be very hard for the Democrats to take back the Senate. And it's going to be hard because of something that is actually built into the Constitution. And that is a form of gerrymandering that we don't call gerrymandering. It's that you've got states like California and states like Wyoming that each have 2 senators. 18 million more people voted for Democratic senator and senatorial candidates in 2016 than for Republicans. And yet the Republicans ended up with 2 more senators. So as long as we have that, it's going to be hard. It's not going to be impossible. It's just going to be difficult. The one thing that may make it slightly easier than it was in 2016 next time around, or 2018 rather, next time around, is that there will be many more Republicans up for re-election. But it's keep your expectations in check.
Next question on your left.
If, as a specialist in both realpolitik and morality, what would you do about the situation in Virginia?
I think it is, frankly, inexcusable for somebody, even 30 years ago, to parade around as a Ku Klux Klan member and put on blackface. And it would be one thing if this was just a normal person holding any job, but if they're governor of Virginia or if they are a very senior official, I just don't see how we can tolerate that, particularly if we are Democrats who believe in equal opportunity and equal protection under the Constitution, and if we want to eradicate the vestiges of the ugly racist past in this country.
Next question on your right.
Hi, this isn't really a question. I was just wondering whether it warmed your heart when the Dutch historian gave the 1-minute lecture to the folks at Davos.
You're talking about the Dutch historian who said to the group at Davos that why aren't you talking about tax avoidance? And why aren't you talking about the rich? You know, I used to be invited to Davos. I never went, and they stopped inviting me. I think one of the problems we have, and certainly the global economy has, is that as super wealthy people lose connection with middle class and lower middle class and working class and poor people, they lose connection in some very primary and fundamental ways. They lose connection, they don't, to be rich in the new global economy really means not having to come across anybody who is not. And so you lose any sense of proportion. When that Dutch historian started to ask, why isn't anybody talking about tax avoidance here? He was met by not hostility, he was met by bewilderment. That, to me, was the worst part of what happened.
Thank you. Next question on your left.
With the confirmation by the 2016 election that half the people in the United States are truly evil and have no comprehension of true history or politics, how do we bring democracy to America?
Well, I'm not sure that I would. In fact, I really don't agree with the hypothesis that half the people are evil, or I really do, on the basis of what I learned, not only in 2015 when I did those focus groups, but also what I learned when I was Secretary of Labor. When you're a cabinet secretary, if you're Secretary of State or Secretary of Commerce or Secretary of most cabinet secretaries, you go to conferences around the world in Paris and Davos and every place else. No, when you're a labor secretary, you go to Toledo. And I would talk with people in this country who were close to median wage or below, and they were struggling, and they're struggling much more over the past several years, as I've talked to you about. And when they voted for Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton, many of them, not all of them, many of them were voting against what they perceived to be the establishment. Now, you and I know that they were wrong, but the people that I kept in contact with and still have some contact with who voted for Donald Trump, they're not racist. They succumbed to a certain racism. They're not xenophobes. Some of them succumbed to a kind of anti-foreign xenophobia, but you've got to understand the origin, where they came from. If we don't deal with their sense of hopelessness and anger and powerlessness and humiliation and frustration, we are going to have more votes just like that. And it's not because they're evil. It's because they're human.
Next question on your right.
I'm much older than you. I was born in 1945. I'm wondering if you're hopeful that by the time my 8-year-old granddaughter is of voting age, that we can stop having corporations be people, and we can stop having so much money in politics and have it be financed universally.
Well, I will believe corporations are people when Texas executes a corporation. I mean, the Supreme Court actually made two fundamental errors, and it wasn't just the Citizens United case. Before the Citizens United case was another case in which the Supreme Court decided that money is speech. Now, if you put that together with Citizens United, when corporations are people, if money is speech and corporations are people, well, then the logic just follows. That big money and big corporations have a First Amendment right to drown out the voices of everybody else, and that's really what's happened. Will your grandchildren, my grandchildren, will it be different? Well, it has to be different. The first thing the Democrats in the House did, H.R. 1, the first piece of legislation that came out in January, was a bill about circumventing Citizens United and providing money to candidates that would only take small dollar donations and would match those small dollar donations. And it also, in that bill, had a lot of provisions that bolstered voting rights and made it much more difficult to suppress votes. In other words, there are a lot of things that were in that bill that, if they are enacted, or when they are enacted, will make it more likely that your grandchildren and my grandchildren will live in a world in which big money is not as dominant in politics. Now, do we need an amendment to the Constitution to reverse Citizens United? Maybe. Maybe we do. Although those of you who know the Constitution, the amendment process is very difficult. And if you went through an Article 5 amendment process, you have to have a new convention, a constitutional convention. There's some people who actually say, all right, we'll have a new convention to get rid of Citizens United. Well, who's going to select the people who go to that convention? And the people who go to that convention, are they to be trusted? Because once a convention is convened, they can get rid of the entire United States Constitution. So be careful what you wish for.
We have time for one last question. Just let everybody know that we're going to have a book signing in the atrium immediately following the program, so stick around for that. Last question.
Okay. So my question follows on from this gentleman's. If unions were so important in helping create the middle class in the early 20th century, and we can't count on big corporations to help rebalance economic power, how do we do it without unions? And is there some kind of role for the union to make a comeback?
Well, I think there is. And I think that the concept that John Kenneth Galbraith, my mentor, economist, once developed in a book called American Capitalism, the concept of countervailing power, 1952, was the idea that the biggest and most important legacy from the New Deal was the creation of countervailing power to countervail big money and big corporations and basically the largest and most powerful institutions that would otherwise take over politics. Among them, organized labor, small businesses, cooperatives. He went through a very, very long list of institutions that had been facilitated, their growth and development facilitated by the New Deal. Labor unions were at the top of the list. Now, how do we ever get unions back into a position of countervailing power? We make it easier to organize unions. We penalize companies with much greater penalties who actually intimidate workers and fire them for trying to organize, which is now going on all over the country. We provide workers who are contractors, self-employed, with vehicles for joining together in associations and enable them to negotiate with employers. We make it much harder for employers to actually change job classifications from full-time work to contract work in order to avoid a lot of labor laws and labor protections. In other words, I could give you a whole list of things that we could do, but everything I give you is premised and predicated on the word we. We can change these laws, but we've got to be organized and mobilized in order to do them. One final point, because as Secretary of Labor, I was right in the middle of all of this. Organized labor elected Bill Clinton because Bill Clinton said, if you elect me, will make it easier to organize unions, and I will foster collective bargaining, and I will do everything you want. And the unions voted for him, and then he didn't do it. And they would call me, union presidents would call me at all hours. They would yell and scream, and they'd say, we voted for Bill Clinton, and he's turned his backs on us. And I said to the president, I said to Bill Clinton, look, you've got to meet with these union presidents, and you've got to sit down with them, and you've got to explain to them why you have not done what you promised to do for them. And I went to the labor union presidents, and I said, I've arranged a meeting in the White House, and you've got to now go and you've got to express to him the same anger and frustration that you expressed to me, because maybe if you do that, he'll feel the heat and he'll make a difference. And so I got them all together at the White House, and then I went upstairs because the president lives above the White House. He sort of, it's the last bastion where you live above the place where you work. And I got him, and he was kind of grumpy, and he said, oh, why do I have to do this, and why do I have to talk to these union members? And we came down, and he came into the room, and I had got these union guys wrapped up, I got them heated up, just as angry as they were at me. He walked in, and he did a Bill Clinton, as nobody else in American politics has been able to do. He walked around, and he shook every one of their hands, and he bit his lip. John, how are you? How's Mary? How are the kids? It's good to see you, John. Pete. You're looking good, Pete. I'm so glad that cataract operation went well. Sam, how is the family? And then, when he went around, he stood in the middle of all of these union presidents, and he bit his lip again, and he said, I just want to thank all of you for everything you have done to make it possible for me to be President of the United States. Without your support. And he went on like that. And then he bit his lip again. And then they all stood and applauded. And he went around the room, shook every one of their hands, and he walked out. And I walked out with him. He said, that wasn't hard. And I walked back to where the union presidents were. I said, why didn't you, what happened? And they said, wonderful president. Now, Barack Obama made a similar promise to the unions. And Barack Obama, not quite as charming as Bill Clinton, but with a great deal of charm, managed to get the unions to back off. You see, the problem, again, here is the unwillingness to confront, the unwillingness to stand up and say, this is wrong. This is why a nerve of steel, a backbone of steel like Nancy Pelosi's is so important. Because you get in Washington and you get entranced by the magic, the power, the melody of Washington. You forget where you are so easily. You get in the middle of a lot of money and you forget who you are so easily. Bill Clinton was a wonderful president, at least I think he was. I am still very close to him and to Hillary Clinton, but when it comes to issues like organized labor or many other issues, we missed huge opportunities. The first 2 years of the Clinton and Obama administrations, Congress was completely Democratic, both houses. We must not make the mistake again. So let me just, again, on that note, that upbeat note, let me thank you and say that I am really, when people ask me, am I optimistic about the future, the answer is undoubtedly yes. Partly because of the reasons I've shared with you, the great momentum and pendulum of American politics, partly also because I've been teaching students for the last 40 years, and I have never come across a generation of young people that is as idealistic and committed and dedicated to making this country better than the generation right now. Thank you all.